Now the next speaker is Professor Erik Jan Zurcher. He was awarded his PhD at the University of Leiden in 1984. He has taught at, I don't know the pronunciation, Nijmegen, I guess, and Amsterdam universities, and been attached to the Institute of Social History twice, 1990-99 as Senior Research Fellow, and 2008-2012 as General Director of that prestigious institute. Since 1997, he has been full professor of Turkish studies at the university, and he has been in Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2008. Along with affiliate professor in Stockholm University since 2013. Professor Zurcher has authored or edited 11 books, mostly on Turkey in the century. His Turkey, A Modern History, has been translated into 8 languages. And what was extremely significant in that book, at least for the purposes of this conference, it is that it was the first survey of late Ottoman and modern Turkish Republican history to deal with the Armenian genocide at a time when that was absolutely taboo in any textbook of Ottoman history, Turkish history. By the way, Professor Zurcher will also be our keynote speaker on April the 24th at San Francisco City Hall. And today we are going to return to Macedonia. A second look at Macedonia. The paper is entitled Macedonia of the East, Young Turk Perceptions of the Armenian Problem. Very much pleased that he agreed to join us today.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Yes, before I start, I'd like to say what a great pleasure it is to be here. It's not my first time here, but the second, I think, at Berkeley. But it's a great pleasure for several reasons. Of course, you will get it from Stefan's introduction. I'm not specifically a student of the Armenian genocide. I'm a historian of Turkey, and actually I've been in the business of studying Turkey in the 20th century for almost 25 years, when I was first caught up in the swirl of study of and discussions of the Armenian genocide, thanks to people like Stefan and Müge and Ron. And that has benefited me greatly, of course. On the one hand, it has opened my eyes to what the Armenian genocide was. I've learned a lot, but it also has meant that it's given me the tools to approach Turkey's history in the 20th century differently. So it's not just that I've learned about the Armenian genocide, I've also learned, in a sense, to the history of Turkey in the 20th century differently because of that. So in those senses, in more than one sense, I'm very much to this circle of scholars who've involved me in this, and I'm grateful for it. Now, coming to this paper, the subtitle of this conference, and the crucial years, 1912 side to the outbreak of the Balkan War in October 1912. And that is a thesis that has now been very widely accepted, but it's a very risky one, as Ryan just pointed out, because it can easily lead to the conclusion that the Armenian genocide in some way had become inevitable because of what happened in the Balkan War. Such is not the case. But that there is a link between the two, I think, cannot be denied. For the leadership of the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, the unexpected and sudden defeat in the Balkan War was indeed a trauma that marked their lives forever. The loss of territories that had been Ottoman since the early 15th century, and the fact that nearly 400,000 Muslims were forced to flee from their ancestral homes in the Balkans caused tremendous bitterness and calls for revenge. Newspapers in 1913, Ottoman newspapers, are full of it. The loss of the hard lands of the empire was almost unbearable. At the same time, however, the defeat also caused Unionist intellectuals and officers to look for the secret of the success of the Greeks, the Serbs, and particularly the Bulgarians. How had these swineherds of a few decades ago been able to defeat an empire? The answer to the Unionists lay in the successful application by these nations of Kolmar von der Goltz's precepts in his influential 1882 book, The Nation in Arms. The Bulgarians, through a conscious effort on the part of their school teachers, the priests, and the poets, had created a real nation and installed in every child the readiness to die for the fatherland. After they took over power in a coup d'etat in January 1913, the Committee of Union and Progress not only looked for revenge, which they took almost immediately on the Greek Orthodox of the western shores of Asia Minor in June 1914, also sought to emulate the Balkan states by building a strong Ottoman Muslim nation. For many in the Unionist inner circle, the Balkan disaster had a deeper, more personal meaning as well. The Committee of Union and Progress that carried out a successful constitutional revolution in 1908 and had established a power monopoly in January 1913 was born in Macedonia. Ryan has already mentioned it. It was the committee founded by Mehmet Talat and his friends in the summer of 1906 in Salonika, together with the networks they established in the garrison towns of the Ottoman Balkans and Aegean, that carried out a revolution and dominated Ottoman politics after 1908, not the diaspora committees like Ahmed Reza's Committee of Progress and Union in Paris. Of the older Paris-based organization, only Dr. Nazim and Dr. Bahattin Shakir held positions of influence in the CUP after the Constitutional Revolution. And that was due to the fact that these two were the party organizers that had built the networks of the CPU cells in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and that had been in touch with the Salonika-based organization since 1907. In other words, it was the group in Salonika that determined politics. That CUP, Committee of Union Progress, to use Tunaya's words, had a Macedonian birth certificate. But so had most of the leading members themselves. The 2,000 or so people who had joined the organization by the time of the revolution in 1908 not only were stationed in the region, many of them also hailed from there. They regarded themselves as the Evlad Fataha, the sons of the conquerors. As I've shown elsewhere, 3/4 of the core leadership of the CUP hailed from the Balkans, the Aegean, and Istanbul. And for the Unionist military officers, who were to play such an important role, the percentage was even higher. The same was true for the cadre of the national resistance movement in Anatolia after 1918, the movement of Mustafa Kemal, and for the political leadership of the Turkish Republic up to the 1950s. In other words, the loss of the Balkan War affected many of them in a very direct and personal way as well, as they and their families became refugees overnight. As is well known, the defeat in the Balkans caused the Unionists to look again at Anatolia. Interest in Anatolia among the intelligentsia had already been growing since the revolution in 1908. But now, after the Balkan War, Anatolia was consciously adopted as the heartland of the empire. Now this would have grave consequences. But the effect of the Balkan War was not just ideological in the sense of a new Anatolianism or demographic in the sense of the need to resettle the refugees from the Balkans in Anatolia. The Committee of Union and Progress now started to appoint its members, who until October 1912 had been working as provincial administrators or military commanders in the Balkan provinces, in new positions in the East. We see a distinct pattern here. People like Abdulharik Renda from Yanina, Kazım Özal from Beriş, Tahsin Uzer from Salonika, or Süleyman Askeri from Prizren, were all transferred to the East suddenly in 1913 after an early career spent exclusively in the European provinces. It is no coincidence that at a time when Anatolia gained importance as the Ottoman heartland and the CUP was traumatized by the losses in the Balkans, it sent these people to what it considered sensitive areas in the East. Precisely because of their background in Macedonia and their early membership of the CUP, all of these people had joined between September 1906 and June 1908. They were trusted with important and sensitive missions. That's not to say that they were the only ones sent to the East, or indeed the only ones to be involved in the extreme policies during World War I, the genocide. Trabzon's Cemal Azmi, for instance, hailed from Arapkır in central Anatolia, and the butcher of Zor, Salih Zeki, came from Samsun on the north coast. So it's not exclusively Macedonians, but clearly there is an influx of Macedonian Unionists to Anatolia from 1913 onwards. Now, the contention of this paper is that it was almost inevitable that both the Unionists, who were in control at the center in 1913, so that's people like Talat and Enver, but also someone like Şükrü Kaya, who hailed from Kos and who was in charge of the deportations, and their friends who were sent to the East as administrators and commanders, should see the situation in Eastern Anatolia through as Macedonian spectacles. To understand what this meant, it's important to look beyond the Balkan War of 1912-1913 at the formative experiences of these people in the area where they grew up and had their early professional as well as political careers. The ideas, and what Ronsuni has called during World War I, were already shaped in the Balkans in the decade before World War I. The Balkan War of 1912 was extremely important, but as a catalyst rather than as the start of the trajectory that led them to genocide. I should like to demonstrate this point by looking more closely at the issue of the Russian-inspired reform package for the 6, later 7 eastern provinces that the Unionist government was forced to adopt in February 1914. The background of the reform package is, of course, especially to specialists such as present here, the whole trajectory of its emergence from the Russian decision to reactivate Clause 61 of the Berlin Treaty of 1878, which had essentially laid dormant for 40 years, to the successful German intervention, which led to a joint Great Power Agreement in February 1914, has been charted in detail. Authors like Taner Akçam accord great importance to the reform package as the occasion for the breakdown of relations between the Unionists and the Armenian organizations, notably the ARF, on the other. After all, there was a long history of cooperation between the CUP and the ARF, a cooperation that continued until 1912, when the ARF lost confidence in the Unionists' willingness to confront Kurdish interests to protect the Armenian peasantry in the East through effective reforms. When the Russians launched the Mandelstam Plan for reforms in the East in 1913, the CUP repeatedly asked the ARF leaders to reject nationalization of the problem. The ARF, which no longer believed in the CUP's sincerity, refused. Along with the refusal of the ARF at its conference in Erzurum, in August 1914 to collaborate with the CUP in preparing anti-Russian rebellions in the Caucasus, this is seen as the final parting of the ways, the occasion when the CUP started to see the ARF, the Dutch Nazione, and by extension all Armenians, as disloyal. What makes this argument convincing is the fact that until 1913, the Armenians do not seem to have been singled out as potential by the Macedonian-based CUP. When we look at the statements and the memoranda and proclamations of the CUP before and during, Armenians, like Jews and Vlachs, are seen as potential allies, not enemies. They are members of the CUP, where Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbs are not. They are not targeted with propaganda exhorting them to loyalty to the empire. These other communities, Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, are. This is entirely logical, for as Kazım Nazım writes, one of the CUP members, the political agenda of the CUP in the years 1906-1908 was completely dominated by the problem of Macedonia. It was the threat of the loss of Macedonia to the competing nation-states of the Balkans, sponsored by some of the great powers, that prodded the CUP into action. And the Armenians, or the ARF, played no role in that. In the major conflicts of the period after the revolution, like the counter-revolution in Istanbul in April 1909, the ARF generally sided with the CUP. In the Balkan War, a small contingent of Armenian volunteers, 230 men, fought in the Bulgarian army under Andranik, but by then Andranik was, of course, at odds with the leadership of the ARF. And at least 8 Armenian Ottoman soldiers fought in the Ottoman army. According to eyewitnesses, they did so loyally at a time when Greek and Bulgarian Ottoman soldiers defected in droves. So there is a need to explain the fact that the CUP leadership changed its attitude towards the Armenians so drastically in 1913. And it's quite likely that the decision of the ARF to support great power intervention in the reform issue played a major part in this. Why this should be so, however, we have to look at the reform plan of 1914 to the formative experiences of the CUP leaders in the Balkans. To them, it constituted a déjà vu. To them, the reform package for the East, which the Russians started to push early in 1913, and which was finally put on the table as the Mandelstam proposal in June of that year, reminded them uncannily of what had happened in Macedonia before. And then I refer to the Münchsteg Agreement of 1904. What was that? Well, short-lived Jumayebala insurrection organized by the so-called external or supremist Macedonian Committee in 1902, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, fearing had unilaterally announced reforms in the European provinces of the empire, together with the appointment of an inspector general with extensive powers, not just for what the Europeans called Macedonia, actually the Ottoman provinces of Serbia and Kosovo, but for an area also including the provinces of Ishkotra, Yanya, and Edirne. In other words, all of European Turkey. Hüseyin Hilmi Pasha was appointed to this post. Austria, Hungary, and Russia, which had agreed in 1897 to maintain the status quo in the southern Balkans, announced that they saw these reforms as insufficient and came up with a reform package of their own, the so-called Vienna Punktation. Now, this was accepted by the Ottoman, but never actually executed. 1903 saw first a horrific bombing campaign by a breakaway faction of the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMBRO, and then on 2 August, the famous Ilinden, or St. Elias Day, rising in Western Macedonia, which led to the proclamation of a short-lived Macedonian Republic in Kruševo, and subsequently to its suppression by the Ottoman army, using both regular units and militias. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. Some 5,000 Bulgarians were killed, and over 30,000 had to leave Bulgaria. And it was particularly due to the actions of the militias attached to the Ottoman army. This caused an outcry in Europe. When they met in the imperial hunting lodge in München, the Austrian emperor and the Russian Tsar approved a set of reform proposals that essentially repeated the Vienna Agreement, but now indicated how this would be carried out. This so-called München program contained 9 articles. To track the execution of the reforms, 2 advisors, one Russian and one Austrian, would be attached to the staff of the Inspector General. The gendarmerie in the Macedonian provinces would be placed under a European general and supported by the great powers. Provincial boundaries would be redrawn according to ethnic composition of the population. There would be a decentralization of the provincial administration. Mixed Muslim-Christian commissions would investigate the crimes committed during the rebellion and its suppression. The Ottoman government would assist in the return of Christians who had fled, restore their properties, and recompense them for their losses. Christians returning to destroyed villages would not have to pay taxes for 2 years. The Ottoman government would execute without further delay reforms that had earlier been agreed, and the irregular militias that had committed most of the brutalities would be disbanded. After some resistance and protracted negotiations about things like the headgear of the projected gendarmerie, the proposals were accepted both by the other great powers and by the Ottoman government. The aim of the Russians was to stabilize the situation and forestall the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. It's a very important point, and this has been discussed this morning as well. Reforms were an alternative to the breakup of the empire, not on the way. Therefore, it made the Macedonian resistance deeply unhappy, because its aim was or included, and these aims would now not be met. And over the next few years, the Bulgaro-Macedonian committees were weakened, and it was actually the Serbs, and above all the Greeks, who gained the upper hand in Macedonia. But the Bulgaro-Macedonians were not the only ones to be unhappy. We saw wars of the Unionists that the situation created by the München Agreement made them deeply unhappy as well. They saw it as a loss of sovereignty that could easily lead to the loss of the province in the near future. The most visible sign of this loss of sovereignty was the new gendarmerie. This was commanded by an Italian general, with the units being commanded by up to 60 European officers, furnished by the great powers. The gendarmerie, and especially its officers, were well paid directly from the tax incomes of the provinces, and they wore new, glitzy uniforms. A new gendarmerie school was opened in Salonika, and crucially, in future, the gendarmerie was to be recruited proportionally from Muslims and Christians. In the meantime, the Russian advisors watched closely as the Hüseyin Hilmi Pasha and the Inspector General tried to execute these reforms. To the future Unionists, who generally gained their first professional experience trying to administer districts or sub-districts in the European provinces, or being engaged in the continuous counterinsurgency operations between 1905 and 1908, against Bulgarians, against Serbs, against Greeks. This was the reality they saw all around them. For the officers, whose pay was often months in arrears, and whose soldiers lacked the munitions for training exercises, the sight of the well-dressed and well-paid foreign and often arrogant gendarmerie officers was particularly. They tell us about it in their memoirs. The gendarmerie force, made up proportionally from Muslims and Christians in the near future, was threatening. Now, of course, neither the reforms nor the constitutional revolution of 1908 ultimately prevented the loss of Macedonia. And therefore, for the Unionists, it was tempting later to see the München package, the reform package, as a stage in the process of the loss of their homeland, even if the reforms had originally been intended to achieve precisely the opposite. The reform package for the Armenian provinces and the negotiations between the Ottoman Empire and the great powers, and even more between the great powers amongst themselves, that produced the agreement of 1914, have of course been meticulously researched by Roderick Davison in one of his earliest works, 1948. So there's no need to repeat all that. What concerns us here, in the context of this paper, is the way it was perceived by the Unionist leaders. When 10 years after Ilinden, the revolt, and 10 years after the Mutsteg reform program, the Union was confronted with this new reform package. The agreement that the Ottomans signed under enormous pressure on the 8th of February 1914 contained the following provisions, among others. 2 foreign inspectors would be appointed by the Ottoman government, one for the 3 northeastern provinces and one for the 4 southeastern provinces. In other words, the 6 Armenian provinces plus Trabzon. These inspectors would supervise the administration, justice, the police, and the gendarmerie. They could ask for military assistance and had the right to dismiss officials and propose the appointment of others. The inspectors were to personally supervise the adjudication of agricultural disputes, which was the main issue in the east, of course. The Kurdish tribal militias, the Hamidiyya, would be abolished, and its members integrated into the regular army and disarmed except during mobilization and exercises. The census would be conducted by Marie, and of official positions would, where possible, be proportional to that of the population. So to the Unionists, the reform program of 1914 must have had a very strong resemblance to the one introduced in Macedonia 10 years before, and in some ways they were right in looking at it in this manner. It was a reform program imposed by foreign powers that was designed to introduce international supervision to protect the Christian population, particularly the peasantry, and some of the instruments, like the use of inspectors, a mixed gendarmerie, the principle of proportional representation, and the ban on the use of irregular militias, were similar. So was the fact that, just like the Mutsteg Agreement, the reform program was imposed to prevent the chaotic breakup of the empire, not to foster it. But this probably was not the way Mutsteg was remembered by the Unionists in 1913. It had not been the way they saw it even in 1904. So that's an important issue. I'd like to re-emphasize that reforms in both cases are introduced by foreign powers to prevent the breakup of the empire. But the fact that Macedonia had been lost shortly after the Mutsteg Agreement made it, in the minds of the Unionists, made it a step towards the breakup of the empire. The unfamiliarity of many of the Unionists with the East and their tendency to see events through Macedonian spectacles also led them to overlook a number of important, and one might even say essential, differences between the Balkans and the East. First of all, whereas Christians had made up the majority of the population in most of Ottoman Macedonia, this was the case only in very few districts, Sanjaks of Eastern Anatolia. Secondly, whereas in Macedonia in 1904 was surrounded by 4 Christian nationalist states that were each of them what they saw as their co-nationals in Macedonia, and to use those as pawns against the claims of their rivals, no such nation-states existed in the East. Even the strongest supporter of reforms in 1913, 1914, Russia, was deeply suspicious of ethnic nationalism. Thirdly, whereas the Macedonian nationalists, both internal and external, had actually rejected the reform program as damaging to their struggle for complete. Most Armenian organizations, and certainly the ARF, actually embraced because it was that and the apparent degree of autonomy it brought that they were after, not independence. The Unionists saw the readiness of the ARF to make use of a period of extreme weakness of the empire and accept foreign intervention to impose the program as a sign of disloyalty. The issue of loyalty, and that's my final part of this paper, the issue of loyalty was crucial, and it too had its roots. What I mean by this is the following. When we look at the statements produced by the CUP at the time of the Constitutional Revolution in 1908, when it proclaimed its existence and declared its aims, we see that its message was consistently double. On the one hand, it claimed the name of all Ottomans that had been oppressed until now by the tyrannical regime of Abdul Hamid, and it claimed to have an Ottomanist agenda. The constitution and parliament would make all inhabitants of the empire equal citizens of a constitution monarchy. Inter-ethnic and inter-religious strife were depicted as products of the divide and rule policies of the old regime. At the same time, however, the CUP also, and often in the same text, spoke on behalf of the Muslim majority, whom it claimed the dominant role. The Muslims were, to quote them, patient and tolerant, but, as Niazi Bey, one of the leading figures in the Constitutional Revolution, put it in one of his declarations, this land is ours, and no amount of intrigue on the part of the small Christian Balkan states will change that. The Unionists offered Christian minorities equality in exchange for absolute loyalty to a strengthened, Muslim-dominated state. The euphoria of the first 2 months after the Constitutional Revolution had died down, this interpretation of clashed more and more with the views of the minority organizations, like the Armenians, that saw Ottomanism as an opening to a more decentralized structure which would leave room for hyphenated identities, Greek Ottoman, Armenian Ottoman, Jewish Ottoman, etc. As Duat Chitinkaya has shown in his study of the Ottoman boycott movements, in particular as Mehmet Hacısaroğlu has shown in his study of the Unionist policies in Macedonia after the Constitutional Revolution, the Unionists gradually lost faith in the loyalty of the minorities. But it has to be said that a conception of the Ottoman nation that not only implies, in Renan's famous words, a daily plebiscite, but also demands a continuous examination of loyalty, is highly problematic to begin with. The Balkan defeat exacerbated these tendencies and radicalized the ideas of the Unionist leadership, but it did not create them. Their world shaped a decade earlier in Macedonia. In Unionist eyes, the Armenian readiness to involve the great powers in internal reforms in a way that seemed similar to the intervention of 1904 in Macedonia, which they saw as an important stage in the ultimate loss of the European provinces of the empire, meant that they failed their loyalty tests. The Armenians did. And this, for the first time really, put them in the same category of internal enemies as the Greeks, the Bulgarians, and the Serbs, and helped pave the way for the brutal anti-Armenian policies of the years of World War I, culminating in the genocide. Thank you very much.